September 12, 1944. A day that wasn't supposed to happen. For years, the world was told that Germany was sealed behind an impenetrable fortress of concrete and fear. They called it the West Wall, a 400-mile spine of jagged dragon's teeth, designed to stop an army in its tracks. It was the physical embodiment of a regime's promise of invincibility. But what happens when the unstoppable force of American steel finally meets the immovable object of a dictator's delusion? The answer was about to shatter the myth of the thousand-year Reich forever. Staff Sergeant James Harmon, a 23-year-old tank commander from Ohio, peered through the periscope of his Sherman, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs that matched the mechanical thrum of the Ford GAA engine beneath him. To Harmon and the thousands of GIs staring across that field, the West Wall looked less like a military fortification and more like a graveyard of jagged headstones, a terrifying expanse of obstacles that stretched from the Netherlands all the way to the Swiss border. The propaganda films back home had shown these dragons' teeth as an impassable limit, a place where the momentum of the Allied advance would inevitably shatter. Yet as Harmon barked orders into the intercom, ordering his driver to throttle forward, he realized that concrete, no matter how menacingly shaped, cannot fight back without men to defend it. The Sherman lurched forward, its tracks churning the mud of the borderlands, and with a sickening screech of metal on stone, the 30-ton machine began to climb over the first line of defense, crushing the myth of impregnability beneath its treads. 600 miles to the east, deep within the claustrophobic, concrete bowels of the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the atmosphere was not one of mud and adrenaline, but of sterile, suffocating delusion. Adolf Hitler, the man who had personally overseen the architectural plans for the West Wall, sat hunched over a heavy oak map table, the harsh, artificial light casting deep, skull-like shadows into the hollows of his eyes. It was evening, and the air in the conference room was thick with the smell of stale tobacco smoke and the unspoken terror of his generals. The Führer was 55 years old, but the war and the bomb blast from the July 20th assassination attempt had ravaged him, leaving him a trembling, stooped figure who looked 20 years older, his uniform hanging loosely on a frame that had withered under the pressure of catastrophic defeat. His left hand, resting on the map of the Western Front, shook with a violent, uncontrollable tremor that he tried to mask by gripping the edge of the table. But everyone in the room, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, General Alfred Jodl, and the silent stenographers, saw the vibration that traveled up his arm, a physical manifestation of the Reich's instability. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command, stood stiffly beside the table, a wooden pointer in his hand, tasked with the unenviable duty of delivering reality to a man who had long ago ceased to recognize it. Jodl knew that the West Wall was a shell, stripped of its guns and its best troops to feed the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. Yet he spoke with the cautious, clipped precision of a man walking through a minefield. He reported that elements of the American First Army were probing the defenses near Aachen, effectively knocking on the door of the first major German city, a report that hung in the silence of the bunker like a suspended guillotine blade. To admit that the West Wall had been breached was to admit that Hitler's strategic genius was flawed. So Jodl framed the disaster in the sterile language of military euphemism, speaking of local penetrations and fluid situations rather than the total collapse of the border defenses. Hitler's head snapped up at the mention of Aachen, his eyes narrowing with a flash of the old mesmerizing rage that had once captivated a nation, but now only terrified his subordinates. He did not hear a report of tactical maneuvering. He heard a personal insult, a desecration of the sacred German soil that he believed was protected by the sheer force of his will. He slammed his trembling hand onto the map, directly over the city of Aachen, his voice rising from a guttural whisper to a shrill, piercing shout that echoed off the reinforced concrete walls. He declared that the West Wall was impregnable, that if American tanks were passing through the dragon's teeth, it was not because the concrete had failed, but because the commanders on the ground were traitors and cowards who lacked the National Socialist zeal to hold the line. In his mind, the war was not being fought with logistics, fuel, and ammunition, but with willpower alone, and any retreat was a moral failing punishable by death. Back on the frontier, the reality of the war bore no resemblance to the fantasies being spun in East Prussia. as the ancient imperial city of Aachen lay waiting for the hammer blow of the U.S. Army. This was not merely a tactical objective. Aachen was the burial place of Charlemagne, the symbolic heart of the First Reich, and its winding medieval streets and Gothic spires were now being transformed into a kill zone by a ragtag assortment of defenders. The German garrison commander, Colonel Gerhard Wilck, found himself trapped between the encroaching American steel and the suicidal orders emanating from the Wolf's Lair. He looked out over the city from his command post, watching as the civilians who hadn't evacuated scurried like frightened rats through the rubble, knowing that he had neither the men nor the heavy weapons to stop the encirclement that was taking shape on his maps. His forces were a desperate melange of hollowed-out infantry divisions and Volkssturm battalions, old men with great war medals pinned to threadbare coats, and terrified Hitler youth boys clutching Panzerfausts that were bigger than they were. As the American artillery began to open up, a rolling thunder that shook the very foundations of the city, the teenage soldiers of the Aachen garrison huddled in the cellars of bombed-out row houses, their faces smeared with soot and fear. These boys, raised on a diet of Wagnerian myths and promises of ultimate victory, were now facing the industrial might of the United States with nothing more than single-shot anti-tank weapons and the terrifying knowledge that retreat meant execution by roving SS patrols. They had been told by their leaders that the Americans were soft, that they were a mongrel race incapable of enduring the hardships of war. But as the shells pulverized the buildings around them, turning centuries of history into dust in a fraction of a second, the boys realized they had been lied to. The enemy approaching them was not a disorganized mob, but a relentless, methodical machine that advanced with overwhelming fire superiority, pulverizing every sniper's nest and machine gun post before the infantry even moved in to clear the ruins. Meanwhile, Sergeant Harmon's tank platoon pushed deeper through the gap in the Siegfried Line, the tracks of their Shermans grinding over the shattered remains of pillboxes that had been blasted open by combat engineers. The landscape was surreal, a juxtaposition of pastoral German farmland and the apocalyptic destruction of modern warfare, with bloated cattle lying dead in the pastures and the air thick with the sickly sweet stench of decaying flesh and cordite. Harmon watched through his vision block as the infantry of the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, moved alongside the tanks, using the armored hulls as mobile shields against the sporadic crack of Mauser rifle fire. Every farmhouse was a potential bunker, every stand of trees a possible ambush site for a hidden 88mm anti-tank gun, creating a suffocating tension where life and death were separated by a reaction time measured in milliseconds. The transition from the open country to the outskirts of the city brought a new, more claustrophobic form of terror, as the fight for Aachen devolved into a brutal house-to-house struggle that stripped away any pretense of civilized warfare. American soldiers, accustomed to the sweeping maneuvers across France, now found themselves blasting holes through the walls of adjacent row houses to avoid the lethal open streets, fighting through living rooms and bedrooms where family portraits still hung crookedly on the walls. The intimacy of the violence was horrifying. Men killed each other at point-blank range, with grenades and bayonets amidst the domestic debris of shattered china and torn curtains. For the German defenders, the order from Hitler was absolute. Fight to the last man, the last cartridge, the last stone. A decree that transformed the city into a sarcophagus for its inhabitants. In the Wolf's Lair, the deteriorating situation in Aachen prompted a paroxysm of rage from Hitler, who paced the length of the conference room with a dragging, uneven gait, his right leg stiff and uncooperative. He railed against the defeatism of his generals, his voice cracking as he accused the general staff of sabotaging his genius, his eyes wide and glassy from the cocktail of opiates and stimulants injected daily by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. He demanded immediate counterattacks, ordering panzer divisions that existed only on paper to strike the flanks of the American advance, moving colored flags across the map with the frantic energy of a gambler doubling down on a losing hand. General Jodl and Field Marshal Keitel nodded in sycophantic agreement, terrified to point out that the divisions Hitler was moving had been reduced to bicycle infantry and a handful of operational tanks without fuel. The disconnect between the bunker and the battlefield was tragic and absolute. While Hitler moved phantom armies, Colonel Wilck in Aachen was counting his remaining rounds of ammunition and watching his perimeter shrink by the hour. The American encirclement was tightening like a noose, cutting off supplies and communication, leaving the defenders isolated in a sea of rubble and fire. The wonder weapons Hitler promised, the jet fighters and heavy tanks, were nowhere to be seen, grounded by lack of fuel or destroyed by Allied fighter bombers that prowled the skies with total impunity. Wilck knew that continuing the fight was militarily senseless, a waste of human life that served only to delay the inevitable by a matter of hours. But the specter of the court-martial and the threat against his family back home kept him tethered to his command post, paralyzed by the regime's machinery of terror. As the battle raged, the civilians of Aachen who remained trapped in the city lived a subterranean existence, huddled in coal cellars and air raid shelters, while the world above them disintegrated. They were the first German citizens to experience the full fury of the ground war on their own soil, and the shock was shattering. For years, they had watched the newsreels of German victories in Poland, France, and Russia, believing that the war was something that happened in distant lands to other people. Now, as the ceiling plaster rained down on their heads and the screams of the wounded echoed through the ventilation shafts, the illusion of Nazi protection evaporated, replaced by a primal struggle for survival. They drank water from ruptured pipes and ate preserved fruit from cellar stashes, waiting in the darkness for the boots on the stairs to belong to Americans, praying for captivity rather than liberation by their own fanatical government. Outside the city, the American artillery barrage reached a crescendo, a relentless hammering designed to break the will of the defenders before the final assault on the city center. The 155 long Tom guns fired with a rhythmic, earth-shaking cadence, walking walls of fire across the German positions, turning strong points into craters and craters into graves. To Sergeant Harmon, watching the distant city burn from his turret, the destruction felt necessary but tragic. A violent surgery to excise a cancer that had entrenched itself in the heart of Europe. He had seen the camps, heard the stories, and fought his way from the beaches of Normandy, and he knew that the only way to end this was to crush the resistance so completely that it could never rise again. Finally, the encirclement was complete, and the ring of steel around Aachen snapped shut, trapping Colonel Wilck and his dwindling garrison inside a cauldron of fire. The fortress Aachen that Hitler had envisioned as a breakwater against the Allied tide had become a trap, a death sentence for the men ordered to hold it. American infantry, supported by flamethrower tanks and combat engineers, began the systematic reduction of the city, moving block by burning block, flushing defenders out of basements and sewers. The resistance was fierce but sporadic, driven by desperation rather than tactical cohesion, as isolated groups of Germans fought until they were overwhelmed or buried alive in the rubble of the buildings they were ordered to defend. On October 21st, with his command post under direct fire and his men exhausted beyond the point of endurance, Colonel Wilck made the decision that Hitler had forbidden. He sent out an emissary under a white flag to negotiate the surrender of the city, choosing to save the lives of his remaining soldiers rather than sacrifice them on the altar of National Socialist ideology. As the firing died down and the weary German troops began to emerge from the ruins, hands clasped behind their heads, they looked less like the Aryan supermen of the propaganda posters and more like broken, hollowed-out ghosts. They marched past the silent American columns, past the Shermans and the half-tracks, leaving behind the shattered carcass of the first German city to fall to the Allies. When the news of the surrender reached the Wolf's Lair, Hitler received it with a terrifying, stony silence that was far worse than his screaming rages. He stared blankly at the map, his mind unable to process the betrayal, refusing to accept that a German officer had chosen life over glorious death. In that moment of quiet, surrounded by the sycophants who fed his delusions, Hitler retreated further into his fantasy world, convinced that the loss of Aachen was merely a temporary setback, a setup for the grand counteroffensive he was already plotting in his fevered imagination. He did not see the rubble, the dead boys, or the broken spine of the West Wall. He saw only the map and the pieces he could still move, completely detached from the human suffering his orders dictated. The fall of Aachen was not the end. It was merely the prelude to a season of slaughter that would test the sanity of commanders on both sides of the Atlantic. While the American press celebrated the breach of the Siegfried Line as the death knell of the Third Reich, A different, darker reality was fermenting in the misty, pine-shrouded hills of the Eifel and the Ardennes. Hitler had retreated from the Wolf's Lair in the east to the Adlerhorst, the Eagle's Nest, a bunker complex hidden deep within the Hessian woods, geographically closer to the Western Front, but psychologically light years away from the truth. Here, amidst the maps and the morphine, he concocted a plan so audacious, so divorced from the logistical poverty of his army, that his own generals initially thought he had finally lost his mind. He called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a massive surprise counteroffensive designed to punch through the thinly held American lines, cross the Meuse River, seize the port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. General Gerd von Rundstedt, the venerable old Prussian field marshal, stared at the operational orders with a mixture of disbelief and professional horror. He knew the Wehrmacht was a skeleton, held together by terror and inertia, lacking the fuel, the air cover, and the experienced infantry to sustain a drive to the coast. Yet in the surreal echo chamber of the High Command, logic was treason. The order went out. Radio silence was absolute. Movements were made only at night, and the greatest assemblage of German armor since the invasion of Russia began to gather in the dense forests east of the Belgian border. They were the ghosts of the Panzerwaffe, the 1st SS Panzer Division, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, refitted with new Panther and King Tiger tanks, monsters of steel that gulped fuel the Reich did not possess. They waited under the canopy of snow-laden pines, invisible to Allied reconnaissance planes grounded by the worst winter weather Europe had seen in decades. On the other side of the lines, the American sector in the Ardennes was quiet, dubbed the Ghost Front by the troops stationed there. It was a place where battered divisions went to rest and green divisions went to learn the ropes, a sleepy, frozen landscape where the war seemed to have paused for the holidays. Staff Sergeant Harmon and his crew were miles to the north, refitting their Sherman, but thousands of other Americans sat in foxholes dug into the frozen earth, unaware that the ground beneath them was about to erupt. Intelligence reports had dismissed the German army as defeated, incapable of offensive action, and on the verge of collapse. This complacency was the Allies' own form of delusion, a mirror image of the sickness affecting Berlin, and on the morning of December 16th, the mirror shattered. At 5:30 in the morning, the horizon exploded. A barrage of 2,000 German guns tore through the silence, shattering the pine trees in the peace of the Ghost Front. Out of the mist and the artificial twilight of the artillery smoke roared the heavy diesels of the panzer divisions, advancing relentlessly against the stunned American defenders. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. In the Adlerhorst, Hitler was ecstatic. His trembling momentarily ceased, his eyes bright with the fever of a gambler who has pushed his last chips into the center of the table. He believed destiny had turned. He believed the Americans would crumble, that the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviets would fracture under the shock of this blow. For a few terrifying days, it seemed he might be right. The sheer weight of the German assault buckled the American line, creating a massive salient that thrust deep into Belgium. Paratroopers and SS commandos infiltrated behind lines, spreading chaos and panic, turning signposts and cutting wires. But the offensive carried the seeds of its own destruction within its gas tanks. The massive King Tigers, formidable as they were, consumed gallons of fuel just to move a mile, and the German supply trucks were horse-drawn or running on fumes. The advance relied on capturing American fuel dumps, a strategy of predation that failed when retreating GIs burned millions of gallons of gasoline rather than let it fall into Nazi hands. The impregnable Siegfried Line was now behind the German attackers, a forgotten relic as they exposed themselves in the open country, racing against time and the weather. Then the sky cleared. On December 23rd, the heavy overcast that had grounded the Allied air forces lifted, revealing a brilliant, cold blue sky. It was the death warrant of the German offensive. The full fury of the U.S. Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force descended on the exposed columns of German armor trapped on the narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes. P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons fell upon them like falcons, their rockets turning the pride of the Panzerwaffe into burning scrap metal. The roads back to Germany became a highway of death, littered with the charred husks of tanks, trucks, and men who had been promised victory by a leader who could not deliver air superiority. In the bunker, the mood swung from euphoria to a dark, murderous sullenness. Hitler refused to allow a retreat, ordering his generals to hold the tip of the salient even as the flanks were being crushed by General Patton's Third Army racing up from the south. He raged at the Luftwaffe for failing him, raged at the SS for not fighting hard enough, raged at the weather for clearing. But rage could not manufacture gasoline, and it could not resurrect the dead. By January, the survivors of the Great Offensive were limping back through the dragon's teeth of the West Wall, a beaten, broken force. The gamble had failed, and the cost was catastrophic. The reserves that were desperately needed to stop the Russians on the Vistula had been squandered in the snow of Belgium. The war now moved inexorably toward the heart of the Reich. The Siegfried Line, breached in the fall and bypassed in the winter, was crossed again in the spring of 1945, this time for good. But Hitler had one final psychological barrier, one last wall to hide behind: the Rhine River. He declared the Rhine to be the sacred moat of Germany, ordering that all bridges be blown the moment the enemy approached. To allow a bridge to fall intact was a capital offense. Yet chaos has a way of mocking orders. On March 7th, American soldiers of the 9th Armored Division looked down from the heights above the town of Remagen and saw the impossible. The Ludendorff Bridge, a massive railway span across the Rhine, was still standing. What followed was a frantic race against detonation. German engineers scrambled to blow the charges, but the explosives were weak, suffering from the shortages of a collapsing industrial base. A secondary explosion damaged the bridge, but failed to drop it into the river. American infantry raced across the span under withering machine gun fire, dodging shells and cutting wires, their boots thudding onto the east bank of the Rhine. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, an invading army had crossed the Rhine in combat. The sacred moat had been breached. When news reached Hitler, he stripped the officers responsible of their rank and ordered a flying court-martial to execute them immediately. 5 officers were shot for the crime of allowing the bridge to exist, a final bloody spasm of a system devouring its own. With the Rhine crossed, the Western Front dissolved. There were no more lines, no more walls, only a vast, open wound in the side of Germany through which Allied armies poured like a flood. They encircled the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, trapping over 300,000 German soldiers in a pocket of steel. Among them was Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Hitler's most loyal commanders, who chose to shoot himself in a forest rather than surrender, engaging in the ultimate act of obedience to the Führer's nihilistic creed. The cities of Germany, Cologne, Frankfurt, Hamburg, lay in ruins, their populations living like cave dwellers in the wreckage, while the roads were clogged with millions of refugees fleeing the vengeful advance of the Red Army in the east. Hitler returned to Berlin in January 1945, descending for the last time into the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden. The world above him was burning, the sky choked with the smoke of a dying empire. But down in the concrete box, the maps were still rolled out. The pins still moved. The physical deterioration of the dictator accelerated rapidly. He was now a shuffling wreck, drooling, his clothes stained with food, his eyes vacillating between blank stares and manic, bloodshot intensity. He ordered the destruction of Germany's infrastructure, the Nero Decree, commanding that all factories, bridges, railways, and communication hubs be destroyed. If the German people could not win, he reasoned, they had failed him. By late April, the Soviet artillery was shelling the center of Berlin. The vibrations shook the bunker walls, knocking dust from the ventilation pipes. A constant reminder that the mongrel hordes Hitler had despised were now only a few blocks away. In these final days, the delusion reached its zenith. Hitler ordered SS General Felix Steiner to launch a counterattack with an army detachment that existed largely in his imagination. "Steiner's assault will bring it under control," he mumbled to his generals. When he was finally told that Steiner could not attack because he had no men, Hitler stared at the ceiling for a long time, then unleashed a tirade that signaled the end of his resistance. He screamed that the army had betrayed him, that the SS had betrayed him, that the German people had betrayed him. While the dictator prepared for death, the reality of the war for men like Sergeant Harmon was a grind of mopping up resistance in villages that hung white sheets from every window. There was no glory in it anymore, only the weary task of processing endless columns of prisoners who looked more relieved than conquered. They drove past the concentration camps, Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Dachau, and the soldiers who had hardened their hearts to war found themselves weeping and vomiting at the sheer scale of the industrial murder they uncovered. This was what lay behind the Siegfried Line. This was the secret the West Wall had been built to protect. It wasn't just a nation, it was a crime scene. On April 30th, with Soviet troops storming the Reichstag building a few hundred yards away, Adolf Hitler put a pistol to his right temple and pulled the trigger. His 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and 4 months. His body was burned in a shell crater in the Chancellery Garden, consumed by the flames just as he had consumed Europe. The news flashed across the world, sparking celebrations in London, New York, and Moscow. But in Germany, there was only a stunned, hungry silence. The spell broke. The fear that had held the Wehrmacht together evaporated. On May 7th, General Jodl, the man who had stood at the map table in the Wolf's Lair and euphemistically described the breach at Aachen, signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at Reims. The guns fell silent. The silence was louder than the shelling. It settled over the ruins of Aachen, over the snow-covered graves in the Ardennes, over the twisted girders of the Remagen bridge. The war was over, but the concrete remained. The Siegfried Line, stripped of its guns and its garrison, sat abandoned in the fields. The dragon's teeth, once the jagged symbols of terror, were now just convenient scratching posts for livestock, overgrown with brambles and moss. They stood as mute witnesses to the futility of static defense in an age of mobile warfare, and to the arrogance of a regime that believed it could concrete over the will of the free world. Decades later, James Harmon would return to Germany, not as a conqueror in a tank, but as an old man with a camera. He walked the fields where he had lost friends, where the mud had been mixed with blood and oil. He found a section of the West Wall that had been preserved as a historical monument. He ran his hand over the rough, weathered concrete of a dragon's tooth, feeling the cold permanence of the stone. It was smaller than he remembered. Fear had made them mountains. Victory had turned them back into stones. He realized then that the true barrier hadn't been the concrete, or the mines, or the pillboxes. The true barrier had been the belief in invincibility. And once that belief was cracked, no amount of concrete could hold back the tide. The dragon's teeth were not a wall. They were a tombstone for a dictator's ego, stretching all the way to the horizon, guarding absolutely nothing. The Siegfried Line was built as a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Do you think modern military superweapons or fortifications today still rely too much on intimidation rather than practicality? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.